building. Without much ado, I will ask our director, Prof. John Markey, to introduce our speaker and to give the welcome address. Prof. E.
Thank you, Dr. Manshuro. We're normally starting, right? Great. And hello, colleagues, and Mr. Sam Hussein. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the African Center for Translation of Peace and Justice, Department of broadly the University of the Western Cape. And we are very delighted to be hosting it, which will be a very robust engagement on a very important topic. And there is a lot that can be said about the title of this lecture. You're all aware of the development in Gaza, the role of South Africa using the International Court of Justice as an instrument of enforcement of the rights of Palestinians, and the backlash that has brought to the country, and different efforts that have been made thus far to try and enforce the protection of rights of Palestinians. And given the history of this country itself, those experiences resonate particularly with South Africa. And so its role in this regard should only be expected and not be a surprise. We have no other person than Sam Hussein, who is an American Palestinian activist. He's well renowned and has done a lot in this respect of advocating for the rights of Palestinians in Gaza and Palestine more generally. Today's presentation focuses on the topic my colleague read out, crisis of international governance and global governance and international law as an instrument for the protection of the rights, not only of superpowers, but more specifically the rights of minorities and the downtrodden. In this case, we are looking at Palestine, Gaza, international law, specifically the Genocide Convention, and then the failure, in my view, of institutions of global governance. Mr. Hussein, I will look forward to the exciting presentation and engage discussion with our students. And maybe I should say something about my student and center. Exactly. The center was established originally as the South African German Center for Translational Human Justice. 2 decades.
Transnational Institute for Global
South African, originally started as the South African German Center for Translational Criminal Justice. The center was relaunched. It was initially established in 2008. It was re-established in 2021. And we focused on issues of international law, translational criminal justice, and we focused on research, postgraduate training. So we focused on the issue of this nature that we'll be engaging with. So we're really delighted to be hosting you this morning.
This is my first visit to South Africa. And I'm delighted to be here, and I have very specific things I want to say, but I want to come with big ears as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit from a couple of the students, their background, their interests, and so on. Whoever wants to, chime in and say a little bit about the work that they're doing before we formally begin. So, okay.
Mr. President, we do to start with you. Or should I say former president?
Yes, Mr. President.
Of course, we will cancel. My name is Sebo Masudas. I'm heading the faculty. My proposed research, my proposed research title is definition of sufficient descent. They're assessing South Africa's international assessing South Africa's international law obligations with respect to the right to peaceful assembly. I'm particularly looking at student protests and how higher education institutions react to student protests and whether that meets South Africa's international law obligations to the right to peaceful assembly.
Yeah, excellent.
Yes. Well, my name is Ampiano Wilega. I'm also a master's student. Proposed research is the right to self-determination in the democratic society. So, looking at the society movement over the thinking.
The secession movement of Western.
The secession movement of the Western Cape. It's fascinating. I've heard a little bit of that. I'd love to learn more. Yeah.
I am also a student that I'm majoring in political studies. So, and I just have great interest in student politics.
Which one you still say? I'm not student with that. See, I'm a PhD student at the historical studies department. And my research looks at the sensory histories of climate change. Also interrogating also the power question on design and change points.
Well, listen, Shamala. I am an undergraduate mathematics student.
I was too.
Just interested in the topic today. Intrigued and happy to hear.
My name is Tonga, and I'm a student in the Unionist faculty in the political sciences department. So I'm also looking at international relations as a field. So right now, I'm interested, of course, in the topic that we will be talking about, because I'm also looking at my research looks at the effect or the extent to which the BRICS countries like South Africa and China are able to, to counterattack the terms of the Western power. So that's what I'm also looking, and also looking at the factors that I'm also interested in the factors that are also influenced by the West in terms of the Gaza trade, the Gaza trade is. I'm also looking at I'm also interested in how does affect indirectly to the South African context.
So because we have people who are joining us from online, I think we should also give them the opportunity to say something. If you want to say something and you're online before Mr. Husseini presents his lecture, please go ahead and do so.
We are good. Thank you so much, Dr. Mushoriwa, for giving us the opportunity, but no comments from us.
I think we can go ahead.
Okay.
Last round. I'm MS Vetanzi. I'm also from the Political Studies Department. I'll be starting my PhD with this one, but my master's will focus on the initiative and recent focusing more particularly on infrastructure development.
Projects. My name is Subair Daniel. I'm a researcher from Parliament. Student. Like the market and basis, I don't know, serving the house and it's like money. It's still like, my just saying that's we also be flexible.
Shazia, to the natural science.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Sankat Morgan. I'm the media and marketing manager for the university. So just from the university's perspective, you are on friendly grounds. As you would have seen, Palestinian flag next to the South African flag in front of our main.
I missed it, but I'll be able to see it on the way out.
So we were the first university, and I think the only so far is publicly cut academic and business ties with Israel. This university is only 66 years old, but we were the forerunner in the struggle against apartheid. And I'm also a journalist by lapse, myself a lapsed journalist. I dabble in the dark arts of PR now. But just to say that I'm interested in this conversation personally because I write the column. And I've written quite a few columns that would probably prevent me from entering the US nowadays. But also, I think the stark similarities between our own history as a country, apartheid, and currently happening in that region in the Middle East. It's very, you can draw a lot of parallels.
Thank you. I see just a bit past 11:30. Whatever you think in terms of should we continue or should we progress?
Because we accept the statement 11:30.
Yes.
We should move on to the lecture. So we had said that we'd start at 11:30. It's now 11:32. So we will give our speaker, Mr. Husseini, the opportunity to present his lecture. If you have questions, please don't despair. We will have a question and answer section after he presents. So over to you, Mr. Husseini. So just a reminder, the topic is international law, Gaza, and the Genocide Convention, power, accountability, and the limits of global governance. That is our topic for today.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to learn of some of the work of the transnational on transnational criminal justice. I don't think that I've heard that before. I myself am not a lawyer, but I was tremendously influenced by some lawyers, particularly one in my journalistic work and my work in the nonprofit sector. I gained some level of prominence in the fall of 2023, repeatedly urging some country to invoke the Genocide Convention. And of course, South Africa did so at the end of 2023. But given that I'm here with law faculty and law students and others of interest in that, I want to give some backstory of that, the trajectory of its origins, as best as I understand them, and also what I see as the strategic path forward. Influenced by these legal minds, which I will talk about, my role I've viewed as radical objective journalism that is able to scrutinize not just governments, but also movements, and how to translate justice using law into actual tangible change. Around 2000, I started getting, the year 2000, started getting emails from someone who I've long respected, Professor Francis Boyle. He was a professor of law at the university. He came out of the top programs at Harvard, legal programs, and the doctorates and so on and so forth. And he was radicalized by the Vietnam War, and he used his intellectual capacities and the education that he got against the system as much as possible. One of the things that he and we exchanged emails frequently on different topics, and something he'd keep raising was, why don't the Palestinians invoke the Genocide Convention against Israel? I didn't know what the heck he was talking about, or I had very little sense. Now, he represented the Bosnians in their case at the ICJ in the 1990s, and he actually went up against an Israeli lawyer in that case. He wrote a book about that. He's written several books on Palestinians, on his fight for the Bosnians, and others. Finally, I began to understand what he was talking about when the 2014 attack happened in Gaza. Israel has its mowing the lawn operations where they, attack Gaza for, 30 days, 60 days, whatever. They would do this. Here's the one in 2014 is quite large. There were several governments who were saying this is beginning to look like genocide. South Africa, Brazil, leaders of these governments were saying that. So I noticed what Professor Boyle was saying at a level there, and began saying, well, if they're calling it genocide, why aren't they invoking this thing that Francis Boyle is talking about in terms of invoking genocide convention? All of this dramatically escalated, of course, in 2023 with Israel's massive attack, probably leveling things. Francis always talked about this as a two-stage process. Invoke the Genocide Convention, get emergency orders, and then that the US is going to block it at the Security Council. The Security Council is not going to live up to its stated goal of maintaining peace and security, uniting for peace process. In the General Assembly, 2/3 vote, the General Assembly can effectively seize control of a matter when the Security Council has failed to live up to its responsibility. There are two notable precedents for this. One in 1956, when Israel, Britain, and France invaded Nasser of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal, and the three of them attacked Egypt in order to get the Suez Canal back and to maintain that colonial structure. The world was largely united in revulsion about this, including the United States and the Soviet Union at the time. Now, the Security Council couldn't perform its normal function because of the British and French veto at the Security Council. So the rest of the countries of the world, including the US and Soviet Union, used Uniting for Peace to create the first real peacekeeping force, which went into Sinai and compelled their withdrawal. It was an incredibly peaceful process because of the overwhelming revulsion by this, the global dynamics at the time. The British government collapsed as a result of this. They withdrew in very short order. This happened in November of 1956. The British and French forces were withdrawn by the end of the year. Israel actually tried to hold onto Gaza into 1957 to the spring, and the US insisted, no, you gotta get the heck out of Gaza, which they finally did. Footnote: it was at that point that Israel decided to get nuclear weapons so that they would have a military capacity to even potentially stand up to the United States and the Soviet Union. They did so initially with French support, When Kennedy came into office in the early 60s, he insisted, because the US was starting to get intelligence at this point that Israel is going to have nuclear weapons, insisting on immediate inspections by Israel. He sent Ben Gurion, who was the founding prime minister of Israel, a series of letters in the spring and summer of 1956, demanding immediate inspections and threatening a rupture in the relationship between the US and Israel if that didn't happen. Ben Gurion kept stalling for time. When Kennedy finally sent him a very harsh letter, what did Ben Gurion do? He resigned. To throw the process to chaos, successor came in and said to Kennedy, I don't know what's going on here. We want to cooperate. I promise you we'll have inspections by the end of the year. Kennedy didn't live to see the end of the year. He was assassinated in November and dropped the matter altogether, as every president since has dropped the matter. And he has refused to even acknowledge the existence of Israel's nuclear capacity. I just had that as my last exchange at the State Department. Right? I've gone to briefings, but they very rarely call on me, but I got that exchange in to confirm that they continue to do that. There's more to that story, but the other main precedent for uniting for peace being used effectively is South Africa. There were several resolutions, including expelling Israel from the General Assembly in the 1970s, and then 1981, there was a resolution pertaining to South Africa's aggression in Libya that demanded complete comprehensive sanctions against Israel, arms embargo, economic, cultural, and so on. And this became a touchstone for the activities that happened in the years since to place meaningful sanctions that ultimately helped lead to the end of the apartheid regime. That was part of my activity. When I was in universities, there was they built a shanty town to protest continuing cooperation with the apartheid regime, and that they helped those moves along. So there are these two great precedents for this. So what happened with the Genocide Convention after South Africa invoked it in late December 2023, they got 3 orders from the ICJ, you might recall. The first 2 were positive, but lacked specificity. The third one was incredibly specific. On May 24th, 2024, the ICJ said, you, Israel, began your invasion of Rafah on May 7th. This was at a time when the Biden administration was claiming there was no invasion of Rafah. Israel was literally leveling the place, and the Biden administration is saying there are limited incursions and so on. The court stepped in and said, no, Israel is leveling and invading Rafah, and this must immediately stop. Algeria, which was the only Arab member of the UN Security Council, was reported to be drafting a resolution to implement that order. That's the way it's supposed to work. The court issues an order, and the sheriff, effectively, the Security Council, implements the order. The US stalled for time, and then a week after the ICJ orders, Biden comes forward and proclaims Netanyahu has agreed to a ceasefire, peace is at hand, and we're going to draft a UN resolution to help this process along. The Algerians shredded their resolution. The US put forward this obviously phony resolution that the Security Council passed on June 10th, 2024, blessing the UN negotiating process and dropping the ICJ orders. An incredible number of people went along with this obvious hijacking of international law, including people who were celebrated, to be totally forthright with you. Albanese, the UN rapporteur, who's gained much acclaim, most unfortunately put out a statement saying that she welcomed this June 10th Biden resolution and made absolutely no mention of the ICJ orders that the able South African team had won. They managed to use their manipulation of the media and the news cycle and propaganda to make everybody forget about this. And because movements can be naive, political movements, even movements of solidarity, the mantra was, we want to cease fire, we want to cease fire, we want to cease fire. They're not thinking strategically to say, we don't just want to cease fire, or even in this case, just simply the promise of a ceasefire. We want implementation of international law and the orders that the ICJ just proclaimed. So the genocide continued, and notice what the US government did was take it away from the realm of international law and make itself the negotiator. Now, those of you who know the history of the Palestinian conflict, this is very similar to the Oslo Accords. After the US invasion of the first attack on Iraq in 1991, the compensation for that in terms of US-Arab relations was that the US government, the first Bush administration, would finally deal with the Palestinian question in a meaningful way. And you had what was called the Madrid process, which was supposed to be based on UN Security Council resolutions pertaining to Palestine, which was sort of the minimal, reasonable way of dealing with it. That became a dead end, and they did this backdoor deal called Oslo, where they put this forward, this structure where the PLO recognized Israel, and in return, Israel didn't recognize the rights of the Palestinian people. It recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. So they only recognize the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians once the PLO starts to abrogate the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. It recently disclosed in the Epstein files, which I think are very limited disclosure, but there's still some good information there, that Epstein was funneling money to the Norwegians in Oslo who were behind this process. He left the children of the Norwegian couple behind this $10 million in his will. So the whole thing was this canard of hijacking things, taking it from the realm of international law into this so-called negotiating process, where the main negotiator is the United States, which works hand in glove, obviously, with the Israeli regime. So the Security Council resolution of June 10th was passed. All of the members of the Security Council, including Algeria, voted for it. So all of these countries are full of rhetoric, but don't do the right thing, or very often. The Russians called it out and put it back and gave a speech which outlined many of the problems with the process and talked about the ICJ orders, but they abstained. They could have vetoed it. They didn't veto it. Genocide continues. In September 2025, nearly over a year later, you finally have Colombian President Petro in his speech before the United Nations General Assembly talk about uniting for peace. He only talks about it in the context of a protection force. He didn't talk about the economic sanctions. And he said that he would put forward a resolution with, after meetings that took place in Bogota with the Hague group, which South Africa is a part of, and other countries are a part of, supposed to stand up for international law. And on Palestine. But he did not put forward a resolution. He merely said that he would do so and never followed up on it. Now, is that because he was just being rhetorical, or is that because he didn't get enough support from other countries? Is a question. That opened the door for Trump to do his recent phony Board of Peace thing with his immediate circle, other parties, proxy Arab governments that themselves have been so dominated by the US empire. And that's become the sort of media face of the process. So it's actually a board of, and Netanyahu is on it, my God. So it's a board of genociders and profiteers leeching off of this process. And notice the branding of it. It's Board of Peace, effectively stealing the Uniting for Peace thing, which is a legitimate political instrument. They attempt to hijack the language and present it to the global public as having some sort of meaningful legitimacy. Now, unfortunately, it has a modicum of, I would say, false legitimacy, because the UN Security Council passed a resolution in November agreeing or basically backing this, at least for a couple of years. Craig Mokhiber, a UN whistleblower, who some of you may be familiar with, has written a number of articles about the Board of Peace giving specific critiques of and how to legally chip away at that. And largely here in South Africa, because I see a path forward in spite of all of these obstacles. I outlined it in a piece that appeared the day before yesterday in the Mail and Guardian, and it's also on my webpage. People can get to my writing through Husseini.org. If you go to Husseini.org and click on latest writings, you'll get to my Substack, where I write about this and post my videos questioning the State Department and other things. And this is the path that I see going forward. But the problem was that Francis's original vision of getting emergency orders and then moving towards uniting for peace wasn't done, because the US even avoided casting a veto by putting up this other phony resolution and getting the countries to vote for it. If they had been backed into a corner, if the global peace movement had been so strong and coordinated that it forced Algeria to put forward their resolution in May of 2024 and force a US veto, that would have shown how isolated the US government was. At that point in time, you might recall there were student protests in the United States, and they were largely centered at Columbia University, which is in New York, and other universities in New York, NYU, and City University. I was pleading with the students there to the best. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but I made many trips to New York over this time, meeting with UN delegations and others, and pleading including with the students there, to get off campus and to go to the United Nations and to take the world stage. They had an opportunity there that I believe that they missed, because once they stay on campus, the administration of the faculty, which was then being called to the US Congress, and the US Congress was telling them, if you don't stifle these protests, we're going to cut off your funding, because so many of these universities in the United States are dependent on federal funding for various programs. And, right-wing Congress people were openly threatening the universities. So I was pleading with the students, you're going to end up getting beaten down by the faculty if you stay on campus. Move on campus, go to the front, go to the world stage in front of the United Nations, be protesting at these different governments. And there were many aspects of this. The Swiss promised, who are the sort of guardians of the Geneva Conventions. Oh, should I wrap up, or just a few more minutes, and then I would want to. So the Swiss are supposed to be the guardians of the Geneva Conventions. I asked repeatedly at the State Department, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions? They always dodge the question because they don't. The US government policy has been to recognize the applicability of the Geneva Conventions to the Palestinians. They won't say it outright. I had exchanges that went something like, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions applying to the Palestinians? Quick response. Of course we recognize the Geneva Conventions. Next question. And then they call on a friendly reporter to cut off the questioning. But I did that enough times that my very able video guy was able to pull together the video, and it's obvious that they don't recognize the Geneva Convention. There were some protests, but there could have been major protests to the Swiss to say, you said that you were going to order a conference on the Geneva Conventions applying to Gaza, and you didn't do it. So we need to do the strategic ask, strategic demand at the strategic time. Going in front of the White House and shouting at Trump, not going to do it. You need to do much more strategic. So the strategic path that I see forward now is South Africa has asked for 3 emergency orders. They've gotten every one of the emergency orders that they asked for. There will not be a final judgment in the Genocide Convention case. The South African government says that they will continue it. Bozell, the US ambassador, says he wants to end it. But even if it continues, there will not be a judgment for at least a year, possibly 2 years. So we need what I think can be achieved with South Africa's able legal team, which is another round of emergency orders. Israel is openly saying it's taking half of Gaza. They're violating the Gulf ceasefire every day, and they're starting to accelerate their attack on the West Bank. Annexation and attacks there, the Gazification of the West Bank that is underway. If South Africa can get another round of emergency orders with the able legal team that they have in place, then that goes to the Security Council. As it happens, Colombia, which promised to do it last year, which promised to do Uniting for Peace, is now on the Security Council. This just happened recently. Now, Petro, the current president of Colombia, who's taken the lead in some things and who did cut off gold shipments to Israel, his term ends in May, and his vice president doesn't look like they're going to win the election. So there will likely be a right-wing government, a pro-Israeli government in Colombia in May. So there is a window of opportunity here. If South Africa can get emergency orders and Colombia can forward a resolution at the Security Council, force a US veto, show that the US is isolated, pierce through the media facade of this board of peace farce, and then force a vote at the General Assembly with teeth, with mandatory comprehensive sanctions and other measures against Israel, modeled on the prior resolutions that I spoke of. Now, there have been Uniting for Peace resolutions on Palestine over the years, including the last 2 years, but they have been toothless. They have called for a ceasefire. Even Germany votes for these things. They have said maybe there should be sanctions against Israeli settlement activity. Very limited sanctions, very different than the sanctions that were mandated by the General Assembly against apartheid South Africa. Furthermore, I see an opportunity in the near term with the global Scene flotilla. People might recall, that's not me saying. I don't think that's me. Okay.
Do you like to explore the specific impact of the 19th?
So the other aspect of things that's particularly timely is the flotilla. People might recall in October of last year, there was the largest ever of these flotillas to go to Gaza. People from 45 countries. The next one I hear, at least 60 countries, maybe as many as 100 people from 100 countries, maybe on that flotilla. And they will, if past experiences, these flotillas, Israel attacks them, abuses them, and then finally releases them. Now, in the past, this has been a moment of exposing further Israel's criminality. That it's not just simply genociding the Palestinians, it's even treating these people, some of them celebrities, in this way. I want to translate actions of movements to tangible legal progress. So imagine if the people on this global flotilla, as they are being captured and released by Israel, start pushing their individual countries to do Uniting for Peace. We want to create a perfect storm that forces these governments to act more ethically than they otherwise would. The US government wants to have everything behind the scenes and to bully people and to say, if you get out of line, we're going to do sanctions against you. You, Russia, if you get out of line, we're going to make your life harder in Ukraine. You, China, if you get out of line, maybe you'll start having problems in Taiwan. You will bribe you with this for you to go along with what we're doing. You will do this. So they want to have all of these threats and deals and blackmails and so on. What we want to do is push it out into daylight and to force a vote on a strong, comprehensive, Uniting for Peace resolution. So these countries have to vote in such a way that exposes them before their publics, and that comes away with something tangible that we can do. One final note, when I came with this strategy in mind to South Africa, but I learned in my time here how so many people are pushing for South Africa to cut off coal to Israel. And I think that this is a very, very worthy effort. But one of the people who worked on this sent me this exchange that an advocate had with the trade minister. And she asked the trade minister, how can we, South Africa, taking Israel to the Genocide Convention, how can we still be sending them coal? And the answer from the trade minister was, we are obligated under World Trade Organization rules to continue trade with Israel, and we can't cut off the coal unless there is action by the United Nations. And this is exactly what I'm asking for. This is exactly what I'm saying, that if there's action by the United Nations using this Uniting for Peace process, that can then be used to override these WTO things, can take away the excuse, can compel South Africa to cut off coal, and then can be used by by activists in other countries to compel their governments to get in line. It could even be used by governments that are at least doing some of the right things in different contexts. For example, Ireland is saying, and Spain to some extent is saying and doing some of the right things in Europe, so they can use this UN resolution to compel the EU to start changing its orientation as a tool against the main genocide enablers in Europe, like Germany and Britain. So that, I come with trying to use legal insights, translating them into some kind of strategy so that movements, which are really the wind in our sails, this is all coming from movements, people driven by conscience to achieve tangible results that really change the actual policies that are going on. And it is about Palestine, but it is about the world because it forces a crisis to change the global dynamics so that the US can't continue to go on to further aggression. Petrov didn't put forward uniting for peace resolution like he said he would last September. So what happened? Trump went on to further aggression. He did his so-called board of peace, and then he attacks Venezuela, and he's strangling Cuba. And he's, people here think that there could even be an intervention here, or at least an economic further attacks and so on. So it challenges that entire dynamics. I want to wrap up, but I even have strategies for how to go over the heads of the US government in terms of engaging the US public on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for sharing such important insights, the role of politics, global power dynamics, the role that the Security Council has played in this Gaza conflict. I will not say much because I know that there is many questions. So what we will do is that we'll move on to the question and answer session. Then after that, there will be student interaction if there is still time. But we will start with a round of questions from here at the venue, and then after Mr. Singh answers, we'll go to the online questions. For those who are online, please feel free to write in the chat box. And when I move on to the online questions, you can also raise your hands. It's now time to pose your questions, comments, queries to our speaker. Any questions, please?
Thank you very much. I think most of us are hearing about the concept of relating for peace for the first time, which is a very special concept. We only know about the Security Council, but we don't know there is this mechanism which can be. But I just want to understand what's the practical impact of this mechanism. What's the difference between it and the General Assembly? When it just issues people say that we have a resolution. What are they actually doing? Do they deploy an army? Do they actually have? What are the practical impact of such a resolution?
They can and they have deployed an army. In 1956, they deployed a peacekeeping force. It had a Canadian general. Many of the troops were Colombians and some Pakistanis that went on to that were deployed into Sinai. The withdrawal of the British and French forces and Israeli forces from Sinai. So the UN General Assembly has this power. It has not utilized it because of a lack of understanding and a lack of political will. But it is there and for the taking, and it hasn't used it because of the sense of threats of reprisals from the United States. I want to stress again, it has used it but not with these serious measures, with deploying of force, with mandatory sanctions, other than the examples that I've there are examples where it was used and it was used successfully. So it's mostly a matter of understanding in the broader public and among movements in some of the legal community and the question of political will.
I just wanted to understand from something following this question.
Please speak up.
Just wanted to understand why what would you believe would be the reason behind pure lack from member states of the United Nations? What would you think are the reasons behind the lack of understanding of international law and the applicability of certain international law instruments in certain cases? What would be the reasons for that? Perhaps you can give me personal as well as an academic one. And what solutions do you think could thus be applied in respect to either both opinions if they're not the same?
I'm not sure I got the last thing.
What solutions would you think would be best applicable so far as the pure lack of political will, as well as times what looks like the lack of understanding, which I don't believe is true, lack of understanding of international law and the multiple international law and international human rights instruments that exist in the body of international.
In terms of the political will in the diplomatic realm, I think it's largely the threats posed by the U.S. Israeli establishments. They work so closely together, and that manifests itself in so many ways, either direct threats, economic measures, corporations that are closely allied with the United States. Big tech is largely an instrument of U.S. power through X and Palantir and Facebook and so on and so forth. So there are so many levers of power, and Netanyahu flaunts this. If you've got a smartphone, you've got Israel in your phone. There's an over-dependency of platforms that are dominated as one piece of the pie. In terms of, and as I say, a whole series of threats and bribes, and there's a lack of countervailing, as I said, in the case of Algeria. The Algerian government presents itself to its public as being very pro-Palestinian. If you hear their, proclamations at the UN General Assembly, you think that they're really pro-Palestinian. But at the critical time, when they are needed to do something, they fold, and it's obviously coordinated with the United States. One thing that, I think I've made a lot of the right moves over the last several years. But, I would go to New York and I'd meet with activists and I'd encourage them to be protesting outside the US mission. And there were, some substantial protests. They didn't reach the level that they could have. And I would occasionally get reports that they saw the Algerian ambassador, go in and out of there a couple of times. And I kept saying, get me a picture of them. Get me a picture of them. And I feel bad that I didn't just report the information to put them on notice. Because I didn't have documentary evidence of that to flesh that out, that there was obviously this coordination going on. in terms of the legal world, I'm not an expert, but Francis Boyle would, email me about how, so many legal associations in the United States were cozying up to the US government and US power, and how so many academic disciplines are corrupted either by money or access and so on, and so that they don't provide quite often the sound legal basis for things. They become another of power effectively. So I'd encourage folks here to be, looking at Francis's books, where Steve wrote about many issues, including Palestine, but he wrote general books, just global order and so on. Sir.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering, in your own assessment, do you think a two-state solution is still feasible? And in your own view, do you think if the fate of Palestine would be set by perhaps the new world order, if and when it does emerge?
A two-state solution, and what was the other?
And if we have the kind of rupture that we witness in both the political and international order, the way it is changed, we now have a new sort of world order, more multipolar, that is not dominated by the United States alone or the West, as it were. Do you think that would be better for the cause or the Palestinian cause if such seismic change occurs?
Yes, well, I think clearly, first, the question of two-state, I think two-state has been used as a rhetorical device by many people to say that they are pro-Palestinian without actually doing anything. I'm for a two-state solution, but I'm not implementing ICJ orders. So it becomes sort of another level of rhetoric, and especially with what Israel has done in both Gaza and the West Bank, of infiltrating with colonial illegal settlements and so on, that many people feel like it is untenable. And what is really needed is a South Africa type solution of one state, one person, one vote in a multi-ethnic democracy. And I think more and more people have moved in that direction, particularly if one bears in mind that UN resolutions also call for the right of return of Palestinian. My father was driven at gunpoint from the Galilee, what is now part of Israel, in 1948, and property confiscated and so on. In terms of the world order, there's another sort of level of propaganda with how the US talks about it. They talk about a rules-based order, and people think that that means international law. It doesn't. I think that it's used as a rhetorical device against international law. And when they think of rules-based order, they think that there's these set of rules, and they can invoke whatever rule they want at whatever time to suit their imperial purposes. So if they want to invade Afghanistan, we'll talk about feminism all of a sudden. And that becomes a pretext. If they want to invade Iraq, they talk about disarmament and non-proliferation, even though Iraq didn't have any weapons of mass destruction and Israel does. So they use whatever pretext they can in order to undermine international law. And so many of these institutions have been corrupted. The ICC was used to go, Francis would call the ICC the International Caucasian Court, because it was used to go after all of these African leaders and eventually against Putin. Francis, he had contacts with the Palestinian leadership, And he convinced Abbas years ago to sign the ICC in the hopes that that would grant some level of accountability and protection for the Palestinian people. And the ICC kept dragging its heels on it. Abbas would write them a letter saying, we accept the jurisdiction of the ICC. And Abbas even went to Hamas and said, is it okay if I do this? I mean, I'm very critical of Abbas and company in many, many ways. But on this, he did the right thing. The Hamas people were effectively saying, we are willing to be subject to prosecution by the ICC if the Israeli official would also be subject. And the ICC dragged its heels, pretended that it wasn't really applying to the Palestinian territories for years and years and years. They delayed. The current head, Karim Khan, at the beginning of the genocide, he had a photo op where he went to the border with Rafah and showed a picture as if he's on top of the situation. And part of my motivation to push for the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, different from the International Criminal Court. International Criminal Court, of course, deals with individual culpability, whereas the ICJ is state-to-state matters. Is that I felt that if there was a successful ICJ invoking the Genocide Convention, that would compel the ICC to finally act on Palestine, which it finally did. They invoked an arrest warrant effectively for Netanyahu, and then the US attacked that. So these international mechanisms, I don't idealize any of them. These are tools to be used for human justice. And then Karim Khan, when he finally did the right thing, he comes under massive attack and the court is sanctioned and so on and so forth. That is one other thing that some people, including Craig Mokhiber and John Quigley, who's another very interesting international lawyer. He's quite elderly, but he's still active. He and Francis over two lights. He has also advocated that Uniting for Peace could also be used to create a tribunal. If the ICC is completely blocked, that Uniting for Peace could be used to create a tribunal, because the Security Council created a tribunal for the Yugoslav war. So that could be an additional mechanism. All of these things taken together go exactly to what you're saying in terms of creating a world order that would not just simply benefit Palestinians, but would move towards a world that is more that accords with international law and accords with simple human calling for justice.
So I just wanted at this point to check whether we have any questions online. Do we have any questions from online participants? Okay, so we have a question from EV, where the USA and Germany are the major arms supplier to Israel. The Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, it obliges all states to prevent genocide, not merely avoid committing it. At what point, if any, does continuing to supply arms constitute a breach to that obligation?
This is exactly the point, that in a sense, virtually every government right now is breaching the convention to prevent and punish genocide. There was, Nicaragua put forward a case against Germany and their culpability. There can't be a case against the United States, because the United States, when it signed the Genocide Convention, it put a hold on the article in the Genocide Convention that grants the ICJ jurisdiction over it. And you can place such a hold on when you sign a treaty, but not after you sign the treaty. So for example, Israel and Germany didn't put such a hold, so they are vulnerable. And so you also do have the Nicaraguan case against Germany, for example. But at a certain level, many countries are effective who have helped Israel in one way or another. I mean, one of the activists when I was in Johannesburg was highlighting how many of the drones that Israel uses are from China, including the drone apparently that killed Sinwar. It's from China. So many countries have effectively gone along. So that's a very legitimate point. That's why we need to find ways of translating these insights into meaningful political action to put governments on the defensive in terms of their conduct.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from online? Then I'll come back here. Oh, okay. I think this was first, and then we go to that one.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I just want to get a sense of where you are at with regards to your own feeling around your trust in law and legal institutions. Do you think we are existing in a lawless society? And also, I'm just curious to know also if you are having a pessimistic posture towards these legal institutions by saying that we should rethink or reimagine sort of a new kind of legal order that should kind of go. I don't know if it makes sense.
No, it makes sense, and there are certainly times when you fall into despair. See so much carnage and so much injustice, and the powerful are able to, what was the, laws are like cobwebs. They only capture the weak and they don't capture the strong. But we have to try to redefine what power means and try to make it that might makes right and not that right makes might and not the other way around. So I try not to be pessimistic. I don't have faith in the law as it exists now. I simply see it as an instrument for a core morality. It's my same attitude on journalism. I don't have faith in the journalistic structure that exists now, particularly given its economics and political dynamics. I'm on X. I have no faith that X is a fair platform in any way, shape, or form. But I try to use it in whatever way that I can and build towards something better and different. So I think we can try to do both to engage the system as it exists and force a crisis to expose its failures in as clear and stark terms as possible. And hopefully that will give rise to a much more just system.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. So yeah, my question quite simple. So my question will be regarding to do you have faith and to add to that also in multilateral institutions? So and also, according to you, do you think multilateralism is coming to an end? I mean, we see now institutions, I mean, they're not working as usual according to international relations, and that's the reason why we study international relations, to understand these interactions between states. But we kind of like live in an international system that is now maybe led by nation states that are prioritizing national interests instead of collective cooperation as per liberal institutionalism would say. We see the facade of the world peace, right? And then we're also now seeing states also in Europe that are trying to hold on to this multilateralism, France and saying no to world peace. So then do you still have faith? Like the gentleman was asking if you have faith in the legal institution, we have faith in our multilateral institutions.
By multilateral institutions, I mean, that includes things like the G7 and the G20 and BRICS, and so on. My friend Patrick Bond describes BRICS, or at least many BRICS members, as sort of a sub-imperialism, that the US dominated system, hand in glove with Israel, it's sort of the overarching imperialism, and that you have effectively sub-imperialisms. And that's one way of looking at it. I sort of view it as they're allowed junior partners and they get to take care of their core interests in their spheres of influence. And, China and its economic penetration in many parts of the world, for example, whereas the United States establishment exercises overarching control. I don't view this necessarily as having anything to do with genuine national interest. That is, I don't think that these governments are necessarily acting in accordance with the interests of their own publics. I think that there is an overarching people who are financially privileged in different countries that act to the detriment of their own publics. I mean, in the United States, you have people on the political right who are against the U.S. support for Israel, including people who I don't trust politically and who I have many differences with, but are very prominent, who give voice to Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Margaret Taylor Greene and Tom Massey are voices on the U.S. right, and meanwhile the U.S. has squandered, 20 years, 30 years of wars in the Middle East and so on, and its infrastructure is neglected, and many people don't have health care. So I believe when we talk about national interest, we have to realize that it's different people get benefits, and the publics, I see it most clearly in the United States, are manipulated into acquiescing, going along, or being disempowered in stopping these wars, but being put into political camps and being propagandized.
So, first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Hussein for the insightful presentation on behalf of the WC this community. So, my question here lies down to the context of the US response to the former Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor's call for prostitution of the Israel in ICJ. So, to pose the question, so was that the US was in 2025 has revoked the visa for Dr. Naledi Pandor.
When did that happen exactly?
I think it was
2025.
Yes, they revoked the visa of Dr. Naledi Pandor.
And remind me, what prompted that? Why was she going to go to the United States?
So in the United States, I think she went for the conference. I think she went to a conference that spoke on multilateralism, if I remember correctly. So that action of the US, if I'm audible, so was that the political pettiness? Was that a political pettiness or an attempt to silence the South African government for seeking diplomatic justice?
Yeah, no, I it was much worse than pettiness, and maybe even worse than that. I think, as I say, there's a dissidence among the US public, and I think that there is an opportunity for figures from around the world to go over the heads of the US establishment and reach and foment dissent with the US public. If a figure like her, I think it would have been even more effective if it was in 2024, after the ICJ orders were granted, imagine if she did a tour of US universities at the time and galvanized and went to the United Nations and drew in the students there. That once you have this confluence of international figures who at least have some fealty to international law and human justice, making common cause with sections of the US public, this would completely make the US establishment terrified of these groupings. They're terrified when the left and the right cooperated anyway. The Epstein files, to the extent that they've been disclosed, that was because Ro Khanna, a Democrat, a very mild Democrat who, by the way, represents Silicon Valley. So I'm wary of him as well. And Tom Massey, this libertarian Republican, came together to force the release of the Epstein files. So when the left and right in the US come together, that's one major threat to the US establishment. But if you have figures from outside the United States making common cause with the US public, I think that this is a grave threat. And I think that's the reason that they don't want that. They don't want the US public to be aware that, my God, maybe they have more in common with people around the world than they do with the people who are their rulers that pretend to represent them. So this is a major threat to them. And they did the same thing with Petro. He gave a speech at the United Nations to do Uniting for Peace, and they didn't revoke his visa right away. A day or two later, he was literally on the street in New York City with Roger Waters, Pink Floyd fame, behind him, who's been a great activist on Palestine. And he then promised and emphasized that he would do Uniting for Peace, and Roger Waters is throwing his fist in the air. And then they revoked Petro's visa because they see that, my God, he can coalesce with the students, with the other activists in US cities and make demands on us. We got to get him the hell out of here. I wish that there would be high profile cases where they would revoke the visas and then have Zoom calls. They can't stop that, to highlight the fact that they're trying to prevent this dialogue and ram it down their throats to strengthen this dialogue.
Do we have any? Thank you very much. Are there any questions from online? Any questions from online participants? And here in the room, are there anyone? Okay.
I think it's I often, as someone that's not involved in, I think of the emotional impacts of a lot of these happenings on people. And I'm curious about your thoughts on how this one country or united front would be received by, let's call them the Palestinian public, like public opinion. Do you think it would be considered justice enough, given that that this policy would seem to kind of juxtapose against what you read in the media about how Palestinians consider the country to still be theirs, and also your thoughts on
what Palestinians consider what to still be theirs?
Of the country, because it was originally theirs.
Yes.
And also your thoughts on the Hamas and the Palestinian interrogations.
Okay. The emotional impact of things, there are many dimensions to that. And some of it is very real and some of it is manipulated. And I think sometimes movements take great solace from putting something before the public, and that's a moment of emotional release. That's happened with past flotillas in the United States when you had the Occupy movement about economic justice and the Bernie Sanders campaign that made economic inequality the central thing. People have an emotional release to say, hey, there's a public discussion about something that really matters to people. But it's sometimes used in such a way that it doesn't end up affecting policy. And then you even get worse policies following that. So we translate, I think, these emotional impact moments, if I'm understanding you, into as tangible a result that affects people's lives as much as possible. The Palestinian public, one thing I would emphasize there is the disparity between the Palestinian public and the Abbas, regime, the so-called Palestinian Authority, and that it is so unrepresented. Lady Pandor has said that when they were considering invoking the Genocide Convention, when they made a decision to do that, and they were working on the legal papers, they didn't tell anybody, including the Palestinian leadership. And I was like, thank God, because they would have tried to talk them out of it, because so often they are doing the bidding of the United States. When I would go to meetings of delegations, after South Africa invoked the Genocide Convention, I didn't try to meet with the South African delegation because they had already done so much. So I was meeting with the Irish and the Brazilians to try to get them to push uniting for peace. And often they would say, we understand what you're saying, and it could be good, but the Palestinian delegation at the UN here isn't asking us to do this. I'm like, but Palestinians are, Palestinian groups and civil society, the Palestinian NGO network and others are asking for these things. But there's a problem of governance that the PLO collapsed in a way that the ANC didn't before the fall of apartheid, although they both happen around the same time. They both happen around when the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had Oslo in 1993, and ANC took power of governance in 94 and didn't address the economic issues because of the unipolar moment of the time that the US could exercise its control over both of these things at that moment. In time. So I think the Palestinian public feels a great emotional connection to Palestine. They obviously want justice and the right of return and genuine international law. There's clear divisions between, Hamas and Fatah and other groups. And there's a big call is obviously for the release of Omar Barghouti, who could be a unifying figure. Do I think, people from Hamas to many people who support the mainstream factions around the PA, and certainly the Palestinian public would want a figure like that they could all get behind in order to fulfill justice. In terms of Hamas, I obviously have serious differences with Hamas. In many ways, Israel backed Hamas because it fractured Palestinian ranks. There was an article in the New York Times in the 1990s by a liberal Israeli, Clinton Bailey, that outright said an alternative to PLO, fundamentalists, outright saying, yes, these fundamentalist groups like Hamas are known for their violent activity, but they're very useful to us, and they should back them. This was openly stated in the pages of the New York Times, and it was obviously Israeli in many ways, but in the U.S. there's propaganda to conflate Hamas, a resistance, outright terrorist groups like ISIS or something like this, which are often backed by the United States. So I think that there needs to be a proper understanding of what their role is, in what ways they're legitimate, in what ways they've been misused.
Is Barghouti Fatah? Is Barghouti Fatah?
I think he's formally still Fatah. I think so.
We have a question on, so it says, the USA sanctioned ICC, International Criminal Court officials pursuing warrants against Israeli leaders. If international legal institutions can be punished for doing their jobs, can they then survive as credible bodies, or do they require great power consent to function?
I'm wondering what they mean by great. That is the consent of great powers in order to function. Yeah, I think that's a profound question. And one that goes to how do we translate legal strictures to actually be implemented. We don't want that world. We want application of law to be ecumenical. I think that it requires more persistence from movements to make that manifest itself, to highlight the criminality of individual leaders, and so on. One project, I'm a journalist still, and one project that I've been working on is called the Papers Project, to basically have a rap sheet of the criminality and lies and falsifications of major political figures that can then be used and distributed at strategic times and locations. Whenever one of these individuals speaks at a place, distributed strategically in front of various buildings. Netanyahu's an obvious subject, but other criminals and oligarchs and so on, to use what mechanisms we have in order to completely and further expose them, and to pierce through, again, the propaganda. They're getting away with not calling Netanyahu an indicted war criminal, which he is, because of this farce of the Board of Peace that's putting this happy face, this complete propaganda thing before the global public, and we need to find ways of completely depleting that. I think that there should be a far greater movement. I wish in where these courts are, at The Hague and Holland, for example, and other places, to support these institutions when they're comporting with justice and law, and criticizing them when they're failing to do so.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
Thank you so much, Prof, for this wonderful insights and in a subject matter that I'm not so sophisticated in. But I wanted to ask just what international law procedures that were followed by the US in arresting a head of an independent state? And by this, I'm referring to the president of Venezuela being arrested by the US. And why is there no effective objection by the UN of this conduct?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's the dominance of the United States government. I don't know that I would even necessarily put legitimize the U.S. actions by saying it was an arrest because they an abduction, mini invasion. I mean, there are other legal mechanisms which I'm maybe the professor is more familiar with than I am. For example, the concept of universal jurisdiction, which was attempted to be used against Pinochet, Latin American dictator, several years ago. Other efforts, including here in South Africa, to go after members of the Israeli military, for example, using domestic law, and so on. The U.S. So these there are legitimate ways of going after criminal heads of state, but there have been clearly several instances of the United States abducting, in one way or another, heads of state in an illegitimate way. Noriega in Panama, Aristide in Haiti, as well as overturning governments and so on. It's a big quandary for countries that want to do an independent path. One thing that I have a big problem with is people in the United States who are allegedly on the right side, but who criticize governments or in foreign countries for being authoritarian. This to me is kind of a self-critique, because there have been so many governments that were not authoritarian, from Mossadegh in Iran, Allende in Chile, Aristide, Zelaya, I'm sure many in Africa who I should know more about and don't. All of these leaders were overturned because they didn't have the mechanisms to defend themselves, because they were reformists, but trying to do an independent path. So in some ways, it's only the ones that do exercise some level of authoritarianism in order to be able to survive if they want to do an independent path. So Fidel Castro died a natural death because he was, able to maintain control in Cuba. So similarly, we can criticize. I was a critic of Saddam Hussein, but I understood that if he, ran an open society, that the U.S. would find 50 million ways to undermine a country that was attempting to develop an independent path. And so I'm concerned here in South Africa for how the United States can manipulate the processes of elections and economic pressure and other forms of pressure in order to do a kind of soft regime change. They did this in Nicaragua in the 1980s. Nicaragua, they had the Sandinista government and they were having elections, and the US did this Contra war where they were funding these mercenaries. They funded them through Israel, by the way. That's one of the utilities of Israel, is that it can funnel weapons with minimal accountability. So you don't have to go through the US Congress. They funneled weapons so that they made clear to Nicaragua, we're going to continue attacking you if you keep this government. So the public there said, okay, we'll vote for who you want us to vote for. So it was a democratic process with a gun pointed to their head. That's not a meaningful democratic process. So we have to guard against this too. There are so many mechanisms that they use in order to subvert meaningful democracy, and we have to be creative in how we restore democracy, restorable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zain. Before we give him another round, I just want to briefly read his biography so that we can all know who we're interacting with. So Mr. Zain is a US-based Palestinian journalist who played an important role in advocating for the application of the Genocide Convention in relation to Israel and the International Court of Justice, He has publicly commended South Africa's leadership at the ICJ and is currently urging the Uniting for Peace mechanism at the UN General Assembly to bypass the US veto at the Security Council. His work focuses on international law, media accountability, and the role of powerful states in obstructing justice. He is well known for directly challenging the US State Department on issues such as the application of the Geneva Conventions to Gaza and the refusal to acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons, and was recently removed from a press conference while raising these questions. So let us give Mr. Sen another round of applause. Before we end the meeting, I'll just ask Prof. John Maki, the director of the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice, to give the closing remarks. Prof.
Thank you, Dr. Bushirwa, and thank you very much. And Sen, we really enjoyed your detailed explanation of this very complex case in all of its nuances and the limits of international law when confronted by power, because exactly that is where we are. The Arab-Israeli case is an unfortunate one. And one question I would have loved to ask you, but you don't need to give me an answer now, is it seems like the Arab world has been quiet in this particular crisis, or let's say this round of the crisis, unlike previous episodes that we've had. And now I'm curious, like, why? And it had to take South Africa to initiate the ICJ case. And when one would ordinarily have expected that the immediate neighbor of Palestine could have done far better than it done so far.
Very briefly, you're absolutely right. And I'm extremely critical, and I question them when I went to the United Nations, the Arab regimes who are quislings of the United States in many ways. And I tried to come up with ways of subverting and exposing their acquiescence. But we should also bear in mind that the United States has spent the last 20 years attacking any independent government. Iraq, Libya, Syria, anybody who tried to stand up and form an independent path became a failed state, and it was made to collapse, so that their main collaborators, like the UAE, which is doing criminality in Sudan now, and Saudi Arabia, have become the dominant forces in the Arab world. So I think they need to be criticized incredibly heavily, but there are reasons that show the trajectory and the Machiavellian strategy that the U.S. government pursued.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that leaves us with a task as young researchers. There is a huge task for the Global South, the G77, and all other opportunity of mobilization for justice, not for some, justice for all. So with that, I would say thank you very much for giving us this presentation.
So for those who are here, there is coffee, biscuits, and